LiSTNR production.
What secrets do documents hide, and how are they uncovered? From forged wills to counterfeit passports, the world of document examination is a high-stakes game of detection and deception. No one knows this better than Justin Watt, a forensic document examiner with the Department of Home Affairs. In this episode, Justin unravels how clues invisible to the naked eye busted a serial bank robber, what your handwriting can and can't reveal about you, and what it takes to fake a passport. My name's Catherine Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author, and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world.
Somebody asked, how'd you get started? And I'd point out that when I was 16, I altered a photocopy of my birth certificate, and that allowed me to go drinking. I'm well outside statute of limitations on this, so that's fine. But so that was, I started, I guess, as a crook, a little bit of identity fraud.
Well, the number of fake IDs that people present to pubs and clubs is quite phenomenal. I've always wondered who does them.
Yeah, we see quite a few in my role. We stop a lot of them at the border. They're coming in from, East Europe, Southeast Asia. One year we ruined schoolies for a lot of kids. We seized hundreds.
How are so many schoolies getting these fake IDs that come from overseas?
Yeah, I think the internet, obviously there's a lot of focus on things that happen on the internet with regard to pornography, children's access to pornography, etc. But everything is available there. Sometimes it's not particularly hidden, and other times it's within the dark net, and it's all available there. We have an issue, I know, in Australia at the moment with 3D printed firearms. People are obtaining plans and able to print firearms. So it's the internet. It's lots of positive, but there's a real downside to that freely accessible information, or for cost, user pays.
So what do these groups want do they want photos of the teenagers?
Yeah, invariably what we've found when we've looked at them, they obviously supply a photo of themselves, and they will often put a false name and a false address, but it will be details that are similar to their own, and obviously a false date of birth. So invariably they're keeping the day and the month, but of course we'll change the year to make them 18, 19 or 20. And then of course they need to be delivered. You can put any address on it. Some of the addresses we've seen on them are legitimate addresses. You do Google Map search. Other times they're a fictitious address.
Well, in terms of document examination, how do you start being trained? Do you learn on the job? Is there someone to train you? Is there a course that you do?
Yeah, this really worked for me. I had no interest in going to university after high school. Traditionally in this field, it's usually a sort of a 5-year in-house training program, or at least it was when I started in this line of work 26 years ago. So you train under people that have done it before. And I had to satisfy my OIC that I had met the required standard. And then, once you hit that mark, you start doing reports under your own name, which involved then accompanying a court statement. And then you basically went to court. And every time I go to court, even now, I have to qualify myself that I am, under the court system, I am an expert.
What sort of documents were you asked to examine, and what sort of approach did you take? What were you looking at in those particular documents?
Yeah, so police work is quite varied. Doc exam itself is a very broad field. So when we talk about documents, your average person will think about a piece of paper with some writing on it. Really, it's any substrate. We see a lot more synthetic substrates now. Like we were talking about driver's licenses before. When I was 16 and friends with licenses, it was a computer printout with tractor feed holes down the side of the paper, and it had a signature which they applied at the time of getting the license, and there was no photo. And of course, now a modern driver's license is like a polycarbonate with appropriate security features built into it. But the casework in police is very varied, and it was things like threatening letters and bank hold-up notes, and we used to do a lot of internals jobs as well. So you would see allegations that documents have been falsified. So if everything from timesheets through to occurrence books and overtime sheets and things like that. So basically anything that can hold ink, and then of course the documents that people will create, even something that looks completely innocent like a birthday card would occasionally come in, and you go, well, what's wrong with somebody receiving a birthday card? But if there's a violence restraining order in place, the person's not to have any contact, and that includes written communication, and therefore we would look at the handwriting to ascertain, was it the person that isn't meant to be contacting the other person? Some of the casework was fairly mundane and quite routine, and then there were other pieces, some casework that was quite distasteful, and you don't sort of forget in a hurry.
Is it becoming a dying skill to look at handwriting and handwriting analysis now?
Well, I mean, in the 80s, they were talking about a paperless office, and I think we'll all agree we tend to use more paper than ever now. With respect to the handwriting, yeah, there's certainly been a drop-off. We don't sign our credit cards anymore. It's all tap and go or a PIN number. And we see a lot more non-original documents. But the reality is people will still have or be issued with birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates. There are the identity type things we will still see a lot of. And the handwriting is definitely a lot less. But, I undertake private work as well as a forensic doc examiner, and my casework is predominantly wills and contracts, whereas the handwriting aspect is certainly a lot less. People don't tend to write letters to each other anymore. The signatures aspect of the handwriting, that is remaining, and that I can't see that going anywhere for a few years yet. So it'll see me through to retirement with a bit of luck.
Well, you'll be very popular for cold cases.
Yeah, well, yeah, I did work on a case privately last year where I was asked to look at some handwriting on some mining-related documents from the 60s. So yeah, definitely, old documents remain. I know archiving and that kind of stuff. Not everything has been digitised. There are some very old documents that remain, and I know that lots of documents that are subject to a retention and disposal schedule, and I always cringe when things are getting shredded and destroyed. It's even just from a historical perspective, I find some documents really interesting, and just even the standard of handwriting was fantastic.
So when you get a document, what is your protocol? What is your approach? Who has it gone through before getting to you? So, for example, a threatening letter.
Yeah, so I'm pleased to say I don't see those anymore. Basically, if a threatening letter is received, the first thing people should be doing is contacting the police and minimising any sort of dealing with it. Don't be showing it to your friends. Don't be showing it to your family. Don't be showing it to your neighbours. And definitely call police. Police will either ask you to attend a station, in which case, very carefully, you're picking it up. You don't want to be getting your fingerprints all over it. They'll probably take elimination prints from you anyway. Now, in the old days, I would have said they'd then forward that document to the doc exam unit from my experience here in WA. But that unit was disbanded in 2009, so they no longer exist. So I'm not exactly sure what the protocol is now, but they definitely still have fingerprint experts. So that document would make its way for fingerprinting. And I guess if it's a serious enough crime, they would also consider DNA analysis. But obviously, all these processes, there's a time and a cost associated with it. So low-level things, a threatening letter that basically says, if you don't shut your dog up from yapping at 6 o'clock in the morning, I'm gonna feed it some poison, which is obviously not nice. It's potentially dealt with slightly differently than a threat that I'm gonna, if you don't shut your children up, I'll hit them over the head with a hammer or whatever the threat might be.
In terms of fingerprinting, is that one of the first things that happen? And how does it differ from previously to how fingerprinting is done today on a document?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that are really critically important. And the first thing is, if the document is going to be fingerprinted, that the chemical they use is a chemical called ninhydrin. and it's toxic. Now, if there's any writing on that document, if it's in a fluid pen, the anhydrine actually make the ink run. And you'll end up with what was a threatening letter. You'll end up with a blank piece of paper. So standard protocol is also, we photograph and photocopy documents. And I'm sure the fingerprint guys are still doing this. But in my day, when the doc exam unit existed, Fingerprint Bureau were drummed up to know that if anybody brought documents direct to them, they were not to accept them, and they were to redirect them to the doc exam unit, because there's a very useful piece of evidence that can be obtained from some documents, and that's impressions. I think we're all aware that when you lean on a pad of paper and you're writing something, the top sheet captures the ink, but the pressure that you're applying means that the letters are formed on the sheets underneath, but without the ink. And most people are aware, if you lean fairly heavily, that the sheet underneath will have these impressions, and you can see them by sidelight, and they're quite pronounced. But what some people don't realise, and I'm happy to say this because, of course, it's been all over TV shows like CSI, is you can enhance impressions on what looks like a completely fresh, clean piece of paper, which may have been 5 or 6 pages down in the notepad. And you can find some really useful intelligence, not all the time, but to do it, to subject this document to a process. And it's called electrostatic detection. And that's been with us since the late 70s. It was developed in the UK. But yeah, so we will basically subject a document to electrostatic detection, and we can actually enhance, depending on, and there's a number of factors that play, quality of the paper, how heavy somebody leans, the writing implement they used. But we can often enhance what was written on that top sheet. And so we can provide some very good intel from that aspect. But of course, the ninhydrin being a liquid, if you subject a document with impressions to a liquid, the fibers swell and you lose those impressions. They're gone forever. So it's, this is why we had this protocol in place in the forensic division that, the documents would need to come to the doc unit. And I appreciate at the time, and we had a substantial backlog when I was there. Handwriting and signature cases take a lot of time. But, if there's a fairly tight deadline on something, we would endeavour to meet that, and it would get a higher priority. And then, of course, we would, as a matter of course, we would ESDA. I'd say ESDA. So that was the actual device we used, the electrostatic detection apparatus. We would ESDA the document and see if there are any impressions there. The side effect, this is what's interesting to me, may not be interesting to anybody else, but the ESDA was actually developed with the hope of an alternative to ninhydrin. They were looking for a way to enhance fingerprints on documents and material. And it did do it, but it didn't do it as well as the chemical approach and using ninhydrin. But when they were doing the testing, they realised that the blank sheet of paper that they'd purposely put fingerprints on to see if they could develop these prints, it was basically from a pad, and there was writing impressions that developed. And then so they changed tack fairly quickly. It's like, well, this isn't really effective for fingerprints, but geez, we've got a device that, enhances impressions in paper. The application for that in the police world was huge. People think, you write something in that, you take that piece of paper and you want it destroyed, so you eat it or you shred it or you set fire to it or whatever, but you leave that writing pad behind, and on that writing pad is some great information.
Or can it be also drafts of something if you've used other pages? What other intelligence are you getting apart from just a copy of the note?
Yeah, well, the fact that you even said drafts. So, for example, and this ties into, the internals cases that I mentioned earlier. You would often have police officers that during a record-of interview would have to be taking contemporaneous notes at the time. And then there's sort of any allegation that they hadn't done the right thing, or that, that wasn't what I said during the interview. And we would ESDA those notes. And you would often find similar but slightly different impressions. It was then up to the police officer to go, look, yeah, okay, I rewrote it for clarity, or I rewrote it. My handwriting was atrocious, so I rewrote it, whatever. People practice signatures, so they might do the signature again and again and again on the top sheet, and then on the page underneath, they do the one on that's going to be the letter. And, we ESDA the letter, and then you find, half a dozen practice signatures on that document.
I was just thinking about your birthday card again. Thinking the way people hold birthday cards is pretty much the same, I would imagine, like a book. So surely you get a really good thumbprint on the front and the fingers on the outer sides.
Yeah, it's interesting when you consider the science behind fingerprinting has been around for over 100 years. Fingerprints have been known off for a really long time. And I mean, there was a crook in the US back in I think it was the early 1900s, and he was a habitual criminal, and he thought, geez, these blokes keep getting me on fingerprints. So he took he sanded, or he otherwise removed. I think it was actually burnt. He burnt them off. He removed his fingerprints, and he thought, well, this is great. This will mean that they can't tie these things to me. But in burning them, he'd left a unique shape on the end of each of his fingers. So all he's done is he's replaced one unique shape for another unique shape. But yeah, I digress. So like fingerprinting, crooks were aware. Fingerprints been around for a long time, and yet there is still that element that they don't put a pair of gloves on. And reality is a variable. Some people secrete and leave fingerprints, at the drop of a hat, and then other people they have less oil in their skins and they don't secrete as much. And of course they might also be going, well, I'm going to disguise my handwriting on this birthday card and I'll wear it with, I'll wear gloves with it. We examine disguised writing all the time, and it's not all the time can we identify it back to the writer, but sometimes we can, particularly if there's a large body of writing, people implement a disguise or a couple of disguises. And as you follow the writing through the page, you start to see, for example, if they've changed their slope. Maybe they've put a really pronounced back slope on it. And as you work your way down the page, you see the slope start to correct itself. And you can almost pinpoint the spot where they've gone, oh, crap, my disguise is going. And then it will swing back again really, really strongly back to a backstroke again. Or, they write really small and the writing goes back to you're fighting your nature. Your handwriting is something that you do again and again and again. And it's about fine motor skills and it's muscle memory. And so you are fighting yourself to implement a disguise. You are fighting yourself what your body wants to do naturally, what it has been trained to do and what it has been doing for years.
Or is this someone who's affected by illness or age, like Parkinson's can create a tremor? There are so many things. And with wills especially, if you said you're doing wills and probate, how can you establish if this is in fact a wonky signature?
There is certainly, that is always in the back of your mind. And one of the first things that, a client comes to me and they go, look, I've got concerns about the signature on Dad's will. I don't think it's legit. I've never liked my brother, or whatever the case may be. You see the worst in families when this sort of stuff happens. And, you sort of go before the first thing I say is like, well, when did he sign it? And when did he pass? What was his health at the time that he did the will? Because it's really quite difficult, because you expect, as we get older, we expect things to not be as great as what they were. The fine motor skills are less, the strength to hold a pen is less. And we can put names to it, like you said, Parkinson's or there's a range, arthritis, they all have an impact. But the difficulty is, of course, we're living in a modern society. So as things get worse, we go and see a doctor. And the doctor's like, yeah, fantastic, we've got some pills for that. So they subscribe you some pills. And what was becoming an issue goes. And then it starts to creep back again, as they've been on the pills for a while, it starts to creep back. So they go back to the doctor, and the doctor's like, yeah, we'll just up the dose on that. And then you see that there's an improvement again. So, yeah, it's the first thing I ask, what sort of age are we dealing with here? And like the signature or handwriting comparison, I need contemporaneous specimen to compare back to. And particularly for an elderly person or a very unwell person, contemporaneous needs to be really tight. So if they signed that will on a given day, optimum specimen would be same day. And the reality is, like you said, we've said before, we write less and we sign less. So, you want optimum, and it might be optimum is that day. I will take anything you can get that is in close proximity to that. And even if it's not, I will use it, but it is not going to be optimum specimen, and it's going to have an impact on the opinion that I can give. Same with young people, that young people are still writing as they've been taught at school, and they haven't necessarily developed any sort of individual characteristics. And of course, then we've also got things like guided hand that come into play where, you're on death's door you've fallen in love with your carer and you want to see that she's looked after. And so your carer helps to hold your hand while you sign the document. So therefore, that comes into play as well. So you're getting something that's not exactly natural, but it is their, is their signature, it is what they are wishing. But yeah, there are some real difficulties with it. And unfortunately, because of some of those limitations, it means that a lot of the time the opinion has to be inconclusive. It's a really interesting field where you can spend 20 or 30 hours on something and by the end of it still not have a result. You don't know, that you've got your competing hypotheses and you don't have evidence to support one over the other. As I said, you can alter your fingerprints by removing them, but you're not going to change loops into whorls or arches. They are what they are. And your DNA, you're not changing your DNA. So, but your handwriting, people will try. Your signatures, people will try. People will do it so they can then disavow it. They'll introduce something that isn't typically in their handwriting or typically in their signature, so that they can turn around and go, "Aha!" But that's not my signature because they've dotted that I, and I never dot an I, and yet the rest of the signature is completely fluent, and you're like, it's really complex and it's fluent, and you're saying that they made the mistake by dotting the I. It's like, no, on the basis of what is there. That's a naturally executed signature that just happens to have a dotted I, which isn't in the specimen.
Could that be an indication it was under duress?
I think more often than not, I think the duress, there's other things that come to play. You're highly emotional. There's nerves at play, and we see the same sort of thing with people signing things when they're under influence of drugs, either illicit drugs or medical drugs, particularly alcohol as well. It is your handwriting, but there are things that the fluencies, you don't care about the line on the page. It's all over the shop. And duress would be, I think, the same sort of thing. You're getting that adrenaline or emotions running through, and you may even have some sort of tremor. I will quickly mention there is something that the guys refer to in the textbooks, and that's tremor of forgery. So an old person's tremor does have a slightly different appearance to the tremor of forgery. And so an old person's tremor is often quite rhythmical, whereas when you're trying to simulate somebody's signature, for example, you've got two options. You either do it really fluently, really quickly, in which case the ending result is not going to have the same sort of characteristics as what you're trying to do, or you do it really slowly, so you're getting all the proportions right and the signature looks like it, but it's been done so slowly, it's no longer written, it's drawn, and so therefore you have this tremor through it. The curves are not rounded, they're quite angular, and you see little touch-ups and things like this trying to make it look like the perfect signature. But fluency is a really major thing that we look for in the handwriting and the signatures. And without that fluency, and again, there could be reasons why that fluency isn't there. You're asked to sign a document on your way out the door, and the person, there's nothing to lean on. So the person's like, lean on my back, or lean on the roof of the car, or those horrible tablets that those digitizers where you sign for a parcel and things like that, where you're using your little finger. There's no fluency in a lot of this stuff, but they are still legitimate. So it's all things that a forensic doc examiner has to consider when they're looking at handwriting and signatures.
There's a case that you did work on that I was really curious about as to what sort of information you can glean from a bank robber's note.
As a former bank Johnny, bank robbery is always in the back of your mind. We don't hear about it happening so much these days, but it still would be taking place. And you had two types of, I'm going to generalise here, you had two types of bank robbers. You had those that would kick in the door and with their sawn-off shotgun and yell at everybody and, this is a robbery. Then you'd have the bank robber who would very quietly walk into the branch, and they've either pre-prepared a robbery note, or they'll go to the counter and they'll grab a deposit or withdrawal slip, and they would basically then write out their hold-up note on that slip, and then they would go queue, and then very quietly, make some small talk with the teller, pass the note across, and then the teller would realise they're actually in the middle of a robbery. So those banknotes or those robbery notes that were completed on a deposit or a withdrawal slip, we're going to not, doc exam wise, yes, we'll look at the handwriting, but we're not going to be looking at those for impressions. But those pre-prepared ones, we are definitely recording those so we can do the handwriting, whether the handwriting's disguised or not. And we will definitely be examining that for impressions. And this particular case, it was a robbery of a building society. Yeah, the gentleman had walked in, wearing dark sunglasses and a hat, and the usual attempts at disguise. And, he presented a post-pack box of a reasonable size and a note that he'd prepared away from the building society, which basically said this, this is a robbery. There is a explosive device in the box. Give me all the cash. Don't call the police, and within 5 minutes I'll be out of range, and you can call the police then. And I believe he did a couple. I'm going back here to 1997, 1998, so it's a while back. But yeah, I believe he either did a couple in one day or he did a couple in back-to-back days. So this was a very active bank robber, and so it was going to get some resources to get looked at. I mean, you hadn't hurt anybody yet, but there's always that risk that you don't know if they're also carrying a knife or a firearm. So yeah, it's there was a lot of resources put to it to try to work out who this fellow was.
So what was your involvement?
I hadn't been in the area very long. This is why this one stuck with me. So the detectives attended the robbery and they collected the hold-up note in the post pack. So I received it. I took it in at the counter. I wasn't qualified in handwriting at that time, but the handwriting I understood. I was doing my training and I understood some of the features that I was looking at, and it looked like natural handwriting to me. So I was thinking to myself that whoever gets allocated this case, it's going to be, there was quite a body of handwriting on it and it was fluent. I thought, well, if they can get a person of interest, they're going to be able to tie somebody to this note. And then I did the impression work. So photocopied the document and photographed, and then took it to our ESDA, the electrostatic detection apparatus, and put it on the ESDA. Now, the ESDA is a completely non-destructive piece of technology, and you can do multiple ESDAs. So, you can do an ESDA lift and you go, the quality's, I think I can get better, so I will do another one and another one and another one, and you can humidify the document, and you can, you're basically subjecting a document, you protect it with a mylar film, which is a really thin plastic film, and then you introduce an electric charge to it. So you've got a Corona wand that's got about 10,000 volts running through it. I joke about people. People sort of say, "Oh, what's the most dangerous thing about your job?" And you go, "Oh, geez, paper cuts. They sting." But the reality is, you touch that Corona wire, it's going to throw you clear across the room. So you're introduced this charge to this document, and then we have tiny microscopic glass beads. And those glass beads are coated in toner. So we apply a sort of cascade those glass beads across the document, which is protected by the clear plastic. And there's a vacuum box holding everything down. And basically the toner is attracted away from the toner beads to the impressions that are in a document. And the great thing is you just keep cascading these beads, and it's a subjective thing. You just keep building up the toner, more and more toner. You get it to a level that you're happy to interpret those impressions. So that's what I did with this hold-up note. I'm applying the toner using these glass beads, hoping to find something. There was nothing by oblique light. I'd had to look by oblique light, the first step, just to look for any heavy impressions, because strangely, the ESDA doesn't actually work for heavy impressions, but it works really well for much lighter impressions. And it blew me down, but if in the top right corner, I'm starting to develop some impressions. And, if you think back to the way we were taught to write letters, what was, typically in the top right corner of a letter?
Your own address.
Name and an address, yeah. Fantastic. So, I'm starting to get really excited. Now, I've developed now a name and an address, and it was a letter to somebody, and the content was really irrelevant. We were just looking to identify. And of course, you not jump into any conclusions, right? The name does not mean that person was responsible for the hold-up note, and it doesn't mean that they were the person that did the robbery. But, we've got a name, which is fantastic. And so you start to think, well, if it's not him, it will be potentially somebody who had access to this shared writing pad, right? But, we're at police. You can do name searches. So, tap in the guy's name. And he had a history of armed robbery and fraud. And when my sergeant heard about this case and we mentioned this name, he'd actually worked on the guy's handwriting years before for another offence. This fella had tried to extort money from Qantas and TAA, as it was existed. But anyway, he tried to extort over $5 million from these two airlines at that time. But anyway, my sergeant recognised the name. He had specimen handwriting for this guy from a previous case. He looked at the handwriting. He's like, yeah, that's the handwriting. So, we've got a name. We've got the handwriting. It hadn't been formally done, but it was consistent with the handwriting of this gentleman. Somebody would then go on and do the formal examination because we want to eliminate whether the chance that somebody had simulated his handwriting in order to drop him in it. So we did it and then provided that information to the detectives. This is the person you want to speak to. He's a prime person of interest. And then we followed our protocol, which was to send that document down to the Fingerprint Bureau for fingerprinting. And they dipped it in hydrogen and there was no fingerprints. So, if that had been fingerprinted against protocol procedure, we would have lost those impressions. We might have got there in the end, but it meant that it was a lot more timely to be able to put a name to this offence. And then the detectives went and sat off the guy's house. They went and sat off the house, waited for him to come home, and promptly arrested him. Yeah, this guy was a career criminal. I did in preparation for this. I actually Googled his name, and I found out he actually died in custody in 2015. So he was in and out of prison for basically his from 16 onwards. So it was just something that that was his career.
Did they recover the money? Do you know?
No idea.
Because that's not your role, and you've done your job already. Yeah,
exactly. If necessary, the job a lot of the time for me stops when I've provided a report. Sometimes I will need to provide a statement to go with that report, and sometimes I'll need to give evidence. And a lot of the time, you never actually hear what happens. And of course, it's not appropriate to go trolling through department systems just because you're curious, about what took place. So sometimes you contact the investigating officer and say, hey, what's happening with this? Can you let me know what the outcome was so I can, at least give some feedback?
In terms of your work now with Home Affairs, I understand that there's a lot that you obviously can't talk about, but what do you think are the biggest challenges in terms of document analysis and investigation? What do you think are the biggest challenges that Home Affairs faces?
I think one of the biggest challenges is volume. And that also plays into our favour because, 99.9% of people do the right thing. And so those people aren't an issue for us. But it's that tiny, tiny part of a percent that are doing the wrong thing. And whether that's somebody has done the wrong thing to better themselves, or whether that's a transnational crime organisation that is massively getting their gangs to travel internationally, and I'm not just talking Australia, globally, they cross borders and they have counterfeit euro banknotes and they have skimming devices for ATMs. It's a huge business for these crime gangs.
Trafficking people as well.
Yeah, exactly right. The whole, some people want to be trafficked, and then you get your sexual servitude type and trafficking of children. There is progress. It's great to say that over the years technology has changed. You might be surprised to note that I've got a bit of an English accent, and I shouldn't after 45 years, but I do. I came to Australia in 1979 on my mum's passport. My sister and I both travelled in on the basis that our names were written in my mum's passport. No photograph. It's not appropriate in modern day for certainly. Everybody needs a passport. Everybody needs a passport with their photo, and it doesn't matter if your child is 6 months old. The department it's not just about doc exam. Home Affairs has got a massive forensic capability that includes fingerprint experts and facial analysis experts. Like the facial, when you look at somebody broadly, people look similar. But when you really sort of drill down to the nitty gritty, you sort of know, the person on the left, their eyes are further apart than the person on the right. I think the biggest issue really for the department and this sort of crime, this fraud that's taking place, is the fact that people expect to be processed quickly, and I understand that. I fully appreciate that we've got planes that can carry 550 people. you don't want to be that last person off that plane. You don't want to be that last person in the queue waiting to be processed. And things like SmartGate technology now that allows people to present their own document to a document scanner and answer some questions, and that processes them basically, populates movement records and does some document checks. That's great. But the technology doesn't replace people. And because of that, I work really closely, myself and my colleagues. And I should point out, there's 15, I think there's 15 qualified forensic doc examiners who work for Home Affairs. There's 3 of us in WA and a trainee. Our airport is 24/7. We can't cover that airport. So it's really important that we train our Border Force colleagues to do the initial detection, that they are trained to a high standard. They're assessed, and we provide them with some top-of-the-range equipment as well, and they receive training on that equipment. And if they make a detection and they detect a fraudulent or a counterfeit document, that's fantastic. That's great. And then they'll contact us because we do the quality assurance role. And we see all sorts of documents. My role, we're doing bank documents. We are doing educational qualifications because certain visas have certain requirements. One of the major reasons I left WA Police and came across to what was the Department for Immigration and Multicultural and Indigenous Affairs, it was a bit of a mouthful. Part of the reason I came across was we are part of an international capacity building program. We travel to countries within Southeast Asia, the Middle East and the South Pacific, and we train foreign government immigration officers, and we gift them equipment to upskill them, to provide, so they can make those detections and stop the people boarding planes with false documents. So they're not landing on our doorstep, and then we're not incurring cost with our officers having to deal with them and having to detain them and having to feed them, and if they have any medical or dental requirements while they're here. I've been fortunate, been to 17 countries for the department and locations that I wouldn't necessarily have travelled to on holiday. Don't get me wrong, I loved Iraq. Iraq was lovely. That was next level. And Iran, but places also, Fiji and Samoa, they're our neighbours, and it's important. We don't want any weak links in the chain.
Is a solution to the problem of fraudulent documentation, at least with passports and travel, are biometrics likely to supersede documents?
Australia's got a real funny relationship with biometrics. Your average Australian citizen is really not keen to be fingerprinted. I don't know the reasoning behind it. I don't have an issue with it, but again, it's, I don't have an issue with a lot of things that some people do have issues with, and it's whether people see it as government overreach or whatever the case may be. Some countries fingerprint and take a blood sample. You are in the system, and that is what it is.
If we travel to the US, we have to be fingerprinted on entry.
Exactly right, and you can't argue that, really, can you? I mean, it's that country's rules, and if you want to visit that country, then you need to abide by their rules. The US was one of the first countries to insist on an e-passport. It was post 9/11. 9/11 changed a lot of things for a lot of people, and it changed document security and things like passports. But yeah, the US insisted, you want to visit the US, it has to be an e-passport. There must be a chip. And what I was amused by was the fact that the US didn't even have an e-passport at that time. You know what? It's their country, it's their rules. If you don't want to abide by their rules, you don't go.
With that said, how easy or difficult is it to counterfeit a passport?
Well, I'm in an office environment here. I'm pretty sure they'd have a photocopier somewhere. I could photocopy it now. Of course, the difference is that it's not going to convince anybody, but technically it would be a counterfeit. There are security features built in at every level of that passport's construction, from the substrate through to the type of printing. Using that print process, you can then create printed security features, and then, whether it's got, the passport has a synthetic identity page or a paper one. If it's got a paper one, there'll be a security laminate applied to the top, which is meant to be tamper evident. And then, of course, there'd be a massive protocol around you applying for that passport and then the issue of it. So it's a massive process, and you can get counterfeit passports, but they're going to fail at pretty well every step of those. So for every security feature, counterfeiters got two choices. Counterfeiter will either go, you know what, we're going to have a crack at replicating this security feature, or they'll go, you know what, we're going to not even going to try. We're just going to ignore it and hope that nobody looks. And that's the crux of the matter. It doesn't matter how good the quality of the document is. It's the person looking at that document. If that person sees their job, and then I'm not talking necessarily about a department, you could be a car hire place. If you are not paying attention and somebody slides over a document to you and you're just ticking a box to say, yeah, they've shown a driver's license, but you don't critically evaluate that driver's license, then it could be, a straight out photocopy that somebody's then laminated in an Officeworks or generic laminate. So that the quality isn't there. On the upside, it only takes a little bit of knowledge and some very basic tools in order to be able to determine and work out what is legit and what is a counterfeit, or what was legit but has been fraudulently altered.
So as criminal organisations have become more adept at getting forgeries that are closer to the real thing, how far behind is technology detecting the forgeries?
It is definitely a game of catch-up. I've been fortunate. I attend a number of conferences, and it's the same technology, the same developers that are bringing out new security features for passports. They're also doing them for birth certificates, and they're doing them for banknotes. And so you might go and sit on a lecture about this new one that's being rolled out in the euro, for example. This new security feature is going to be rolled out in the euro, and it's fantastic. And it'll only be a very short period of time. Somebody will, hey, I want that in my passport as well. So the technology is always developing with regard to genuine security features, and it is just a matter of time before fraudsters and counterfeiters are finding ways to try to replicate that feature. But the level of detail, and a lot of these security features now are using laser technology, like really fine laser beam technology to etch plastic, to provide such a nano level that your home fraudster can't even hope to replicate. And even your organised crime guys, the technology is often not actually available to them. So they will use the next best thing, and they'll try to make something that is similar, and sometimes it's completely different. Holograms are not new. Holograms have been around since like the 70s, and I like a hologram. As a kid, I thought they were amazing, three-dimensional. Isn't this clever? And something that's flat. If they can't recreate a passport hologram, they'll recycle. They'll find a hologram from something, and lots of packaging. Counterfeiting isn't just about identity documents. Counterfeiting is washing powder. It's beer. We're close to Bali. We think about DVDs and sunglasses and your surfwear. That's obviously part of it too. But all of those, you go and buy your counterfeit Quicksilver board shorts, and they'll have a tag attached to them, and that tag is a document. And of course that'll be counterfeit. So they'll take a totally irrelevant hologram and they'll apply it to a document. I saw one, it's years ago now, but I saw one that said Microsoft Windows. Pretty sure Microsoft Windows don't issue passports. So, although it was a hologram and it worked, it was not the right hologram.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Catherine Fox. Production team includes Holly Mitchell, Link Kelly and Jade Murray. Executive producer is Dan Mullins. That's all we have time for this week. As you can probably imagine, I'm a big fan of all things crime. I discovered a fantastic podcast on the other side of the world and I'm totally hooked. It's called Red Rum True Crime, hosted by Grace Cordell. Each episode focuses on a new story. Real life, real victims, real crime. A case I'd never heard of is that of the candy man Dean Corll. Imagine trusting the local candy store owner only to discover he's one of the most sadistic serial killers in history. Dean Corll, who they called the Candy Man, lured innocent teens into a nightmare beyond belief. What drove him to commit some of the most chilling murders in Texas history is pretty unbelievable. You won't believe how deep this darkness goes. Check it out. Red Rum True Crime. You'll love it.
Hi, I'm Grace, host of Red Rum True Crime Podcast. These cases focus on the true victims of crime. Why not jump in at episode 114, the tragic murder of Jasmine and Aaliyah? The main suspect in this case gave an extremely bizarre interview to a number of press reporters whilst he was drunk and reportedly high. He speaks about an awful lot on camera and has this completely inappropriate laughing and chuckling response when talking about the case. He may even have thought he was gonna get away with the double murder he'd been accused of, but what he didn't know was that 2 undercover officers were on their way to catch him out, and he easily and willingly took the bait. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Red Rum True Crime. That's Red Rum, murder backwards, REDRUM True Crime.